Russia's cope cages just can't cope anymore. Since the start of the war, Ukrainian drones have been a nightmare for Russian armored vehicles. Russia, once boasting the world's largest tank fleet, was blindsided by the reality that its multi-million-dollar battle tanks could be destroyed by drones costing only a few $1,000s, armed with leftover Cold War munitions. Desperate for a solution, Russia slapped together cope cages, welded metal projections meant to shield their tanks from drone strikes. But as it turns out, these so-called defenses are only making things worse. So why were the cope cages ever used, and how has Ukraine's drone warfare rendered them even more useless? In this video, we're breaking down why Russian tanks have suffered so much, and why things are about to get even worse for them. As of November 18, 2024, 3,569 Russian tanks have become casualties in Ukraine. 2,502 of them have been completely destroyed. That's over 20% of Russia's total pre-war tank fleet of 16,970 units, according to global data. Russia has lost an additional 1,753 armored fighting vehicles, 5,008 infantry fighting vehicles, 550 armored personnel carriers, and 312 infantry mobility vehicles. Traditional anti-tank weapons like anti-tank guided missiles, man-carried equipment like the Javelin and NLAW, and anti-material rifles like Ukraine's massive Alligator sniper rifle have been responsible for many of those destroyed units. Artillery has played an even bigger role. However, drone attacks have destroyed many other vehicles. At the start of the war, Ukraine used large military drones like Turkey's Bayraktar TB2 to wreak havoc on Russian armor, but smaller bomb-dropping or kamikaze drones proved even more cost-effective. A tank like Russia's T-72 can cost between $1 and $2 million per unit. The T-90, supposedly Russia's most advanced main battle tank it can actually put into the field, T-14 Armata, can cost between $4 and $7 million apiece. In contrast, Ukraine's small drones have a price tag of $1,700 per kill, according to Alexander Kamyshin, Ukraine's former Minister of Strategic Industries. Since Ukraine is outnumbered and outgunned, those drones are the ideal weapon for waging a war of attrition, and Kamyshin claimed at the beginning of the year that the FPV drone was becoming the main battle weapon of the Ukrainian people. Little wonder why President Zelensky made the production of 1 million of them one of his government's highest priorities for 2024. It already became clear that Ukraine would surpass that goal by February, and that was bad news for Russia's cope cages. Russia was outfitting its armored vehicles with cope cages even before the invasion started. They first appeared on Russian tanks in late 2021 and were reportedly designed primarily to counter drone-launched munitions, with some observers speculating they might also offer limited protection against top-attack missiles like the Javelin. The Javelin was introduced into service in the US military in 1996 and was designed specifically to counter Russian tanks. Rather than impacting the main body of a target, the projectile targeted the turret, impacting it at a downward trajectory at high velocity. A tank turret is much less protected than the vehicle's main body, and the Javelin can go through over 30 inches of rolled homogeneous steel armor, according to US Army training documents. Although modern tanks feature advanced composite armor that combines steel with ceramics, high-density materials like tungsten or depleted uranium, and even spaced armor for added protection, they still cannot withstand such impacts. They can't be engineered to, either. Giving a tank enough armor to withstand an impact from a Javelin round would make it weigh over 200 tons, which is completely impractical for basic mobility, let alone transporting these tanks to their theater of operations. To make matters worse, Russia's tanks are particularly vulnerable to impacting rounds because they don't protect their ammunition racks in a sealed compartment. One hit can set off a chain reaction that destroys the tank and its crew. The only feasible way to counter something like the Javelin is through active protection systems that can undermine the missile's guidance system, or even counter it before it can impact its target. But the Russians nevertheless tried to find something else. They respected the Javelin enough to try to come up with an improvised countermeasure. Steel cages with grill-like structures appeared over the tops of Russian tank turrets in late 2021. The projections were spaced a few feet above them. The concept behind these constructions was that the incoming Javelin projectile would impact the cage first and explode prematurely, which would limit damage to the tank beneath. This is not a new concept. Early in the Cold War era, tank engineers built structures spaced away from their vehicle's main body to protect them against anti-material weapons, and sometimes it's possible to improvise and see success. During the Battle of Marawi between May and October 2017, Filipino forces protected their vehicles with wooden plates attached to the outsides, which were effective in getting incoming RPG-2 rounds to explode prematurely. The wooden armor helped the Filipino security forces defeat the ISIS-affiliated terror group known as Abu Sayyaf. The United States and its allies tried something similar against the RPG rounds they encountered in the War on Terror. They used slat armor to protect their tanks from these projectiles. The problem is that comparing an RPG to a javelin is like comparing a cat to a tiger. Unlike an RPG, the javelin has a tandem warhead that's designed to defeat explosive reactive armor, ERA. ERA works by detonating outward when hit by a projectile, forcibly driving metal plates apart to damage, deflect, or disrupt the incoming threat before it can reach the target vehicle's main body. However, the javelin defeats this system with its tandem warhead design. The first warhead activates the ERA, neutralizing it, while the second penetrates the main armor to destroy the target. Rest assured, if ERA can't stop a javelin, a cope cage certainly won't. As Russia moved into its quagmire, it quickly discovered that the cope cages weren't stopping javelin rounds. The javelin quickly became an icon of Ukraine's resistance, with medieval-inspired portraits of saint-like figures holding the American weapons spreading online. Meanwhile, the cope cages were an icon of Russian incompetence, which extended to far more than the one domain of warfare. However, the Russians still used the cope cages because they realized the growing importance of small drones, a lesson imparted on them as early as 10 years ago at the height of the Syrian civil war. The cope cage might not be effective against a javelin round, but it could have some effect against drones dropping simpler weapons like anti-tank grenades or even smaller mortar rounds, since these will hit the cage first. Since Ukrainian drone pilots made sport of dropping grenades into open tank hatches in those early days, the adaptation saved lives of Russian tank crews. The cope cages also have had success in stopping small loitering munitions armed with lighter explosives. We have often mocked cope cages on this channel, but the best proof of their effectiveness, at least in part, comes from images of Ukrainian tank crews outfitting them to their own vehicles. By August 2023, images of cope cages welded to a donated Challenger tank began to surface. The cage armor extended around the tank and above the turret, meaning that Ukraine is experimenting with a different design. Okay, so the cope cage isn't completely useless. It probably did save some tanks from being totaled, particularly earlier in the war when Ukraine's drone pilots weren't as skilled as they are now. What did they do? Ukraine's small drone pilots turned increasingly to kamikaze munitions and began to avoid coming in from the top. The thing about an FPV drone is that it's small, fast, and maneuverable. Ukraine's drone pilots have gotten so nimble that they can navigate their UAVs inside apartment buildings and look for a target hiding out in a specific room. With such precision, they can easily move around or under cope cages, and they can impact their target vehicle with sizable weapons that have a decent chance of destroying even a main battle tank, let alone lighter vehicles. These drones most often impact Russian vehicles from the side. The poor internal design of Russian tanks means that there will always be an elevated chance of an impact setting the ammunition magazines off and blowing them up in jack-in-the-box style explosions. So Russia adapted again and began to design ever more elaborate cage armor for their tanks. The most effective adaptation likely involved outfitting ERA to the cages, if the panels hadn't been stolen by logistics officers looking to make a quick buck. Some cages have incorporated sandbags to enhance protection by absorbing and dispersing the impact energy of incoming rounds. This approach leverages the loose, dense material within the bags to complement the cage's defensive structure. There are worse ways to adapt, though. When it realized that Ukrainian drones were maneuvering around cage armor, Russia started to field armored vehicles that looked like they might be out of a Mad Max movie. These cages cover the entirety of an armored vehicle's body and were seen as early as the Syrian civil war. Sometimes there have even been spikes projecting from the cages, as seen in video widely circulating on social media. Russia continued to evolve the cope cage. Another elaborate design appeared at the Army 2023 Defense Expedition that August. The cage was attached to the turret and elevated through tubular poles. Metal mesh was used to enhance visibility. To add protection, the mesh was combined with triangular slats with parallel peaks and valleys. The Russian brass may have determined that this design is far better for stopping loitering munitions. Among the most notable of the so-called Mad Max monstrosities were the turtle tanks that appeared in April 2024. These vehicles featured a sloping outer shell with a sheet of metal covering the top and extending down the sides. While several were deployed, one turtle tank was destroyed in an artillery strike that same month. Such an approach to cage armor doesn't inspire total confidence, as it could limit the crew's situational awareness, mobility, and their ability to leave the vehicle in case of an emergency. The turtle tank, for example, meant that the turret could not be moved. These modifications also make a tank much easier to find at a distance. From there, an artillery strike is likely coming, and no cope cage is going to cope with that. This is why these elaborate cage designs are the exception rather than the rule, despite their increased visibility online. Most Russian vehicles seen online don't have these elaborate cope cages. A Russian study found that cage armor works best against common anti-material rounds like RPG when the rods of the cage are 10 mm in diameter and the spacing between them is 80 mm. This design allows for a 65% chance of disrupting an incoming round. Since Ukrainian drones are often armed with such rounds, this is a surprisingly reasonable level of protection. In general, a design featuring narrower rods with more spacing is more effective than thicker rods with less spacing. The problem for Russia is that the more effective design is not standardized outside of protecting the sides and rear of a tank. The fact that there's no standardized cope cage suggests that the Russians have yet to find a reliable way to protect their tank turrets with slat armor in the way that the side or rear armor can be protected. If there were a cope cage or system of elaborate cage armor that actually worked well, it would quickly see widespread use. But so far, the turtle tanks or Mad Max tanks of the world have been comparative rarities, and the skill of Ukraine's drone pilots explains why. Even if the turtle tank hadn't been destroyed by artillery, Ukrainian drone pilots would have easily been able to fly under the shell and deliver their payloads. Unfortunately for Russians, they've yet to find a reliable alternative to cage armor either, though not for the lack of trying. In the first half of 2024, it became evident that electronic jammers would become an increasingly important part of any military force thanks to the ubiquitous use of small drones that were hard to counter through kinetic methods. Jammers would be needed to protect both infantry and armor from these constant menaces. Early in the year, Russia looked like it was learning this lesson and adapting. T-72 tanks equipped with jammers began to appear on the battlefield. The new tanks understandably made Ukraine's drone pilots nervous. But when these tanks began to be captured in April, the Ukrainians found that their jammers were unlikely to work. They pointed straight up, meaning they were unlikely to protect a tank from a drone coming in on the sideways trajectory. The jammers were also not assembled well. The antennae were manufactured in a factory, but bound together through improvised methods. This lack of effective standardization made Ukrainian troops question the jammers' effectiveness at all. As 2024 came to a close, Russian tanks continued to suffer from the Ukrainian FPV drones, so Moscow has yet to solve the jammer problem in a systematic way. We can expect Russian tanks to continue to rely, at least in part, on the cope cages as 2025 begins. Unfortunately for them, Ukraine just got a whole lot better at countering these too, and all without expensive javelin ammunition. From the beginning of the war, Ukraine has had an uncanny ability to bring new stuff to the field, whether in the form of new weapons like its long-range drones or in repurposing old weapons. Ukraine's use of 3D printers has helped its defense industry in the process. Ukraine started showing its innovation here by taking Soviet anti-tank grenades and 3D printing fins for them to make them good drone-delivered munitions. However, these rounds would be ineffective against well-made cage armor because they would detonate prematurely. But now there are two rounds designed to defeat the cope cages. Meet the FRAGS munitions, manufactured by a domestic Ukrainian company called Shockwave Dynamics. Both rounds come off of 3D printers and have a platter charge warhead. What does that mean? Let's look at what these bad boys can do. The first type is the FRAGS 05975. It's an explosive charge that weighs 0.9 kilograms and hosts hundreds of ball bearings on its body just behind the outer layer. This round is primarily designed for anti-personnel missions. To see why it works against cage armor, we must first compare it to an impact from a normal round. Kamikaze drones often carry conventional, cylindrical, high-explosive warheads when they impact or explode near their targets. Upon detonation, the fragmentation spreads out in an omnidirectional ring. Infantry in a vehicle like an armored personnel carrier who take cover behind a cage are better protected because the cage can disperse the force and prevent this ring of high-energy debris from getting through. The FRAGS 05975 round, though, concentrates its force forward and backward to give it more directed debris spread. This concentration is effective at getting through the cage and impacting targets behind it. One of the first confirmed uses of the anti-personnel FRAG round came on January 4, 2024 in the Robotyne area in Zaporizhia Oblast. The footage shows 5 Russian soldiers congregating near 2 destroyed T-90 tanks, one of which had seen its turret blown off in a jack-in-the-box explosion. 3 of the troops were running. 5 seconds in, we saw why. A small Ukrainian FPV was chasing them. The explosive the drone was carrying then detonated about 5 seconds into the clip. The airburst sent explosive fragments in a wide field that impacted all of them. One of the soldiers stopped moving forward. Another struggled underneath the charred tank. The third struggled to stand after the detonation. 2 others seemed to successfully move away when the video feed cut off. If these troops had been taking cover behind cage armor, they would have had nowhere to go. All of the force would have been concentrated on them and all would have likely not made it out. The second round is the FRAGS 09576, which weighs 1.3 kilograms and is used in anti-material roles. A traditional anti-material shaped charge will often detonate prematurely upon impacting cage armor, failing to deliver its lethal punch to the main body of the target. The EFP-S, however, uses a shock impact core designed to penetrate protective cages and strike the vehicle behind them, making it far more effective against such defenses. The FRAGS 09576 and the FRAGS 05975 rounds both made their debut in December 2023, and each has distinct damage radii. The FRAGS 09576 has a radius of continuous damage of 5 meters and an effective damage radius of 8 meters. Meanwhile, the FRAGS 05975 is larger, with a radius of continuous damage of 8 meters and an effective damage radius of 14 meters. These frag rounds are mounted on drones using nylon clamps. Since the munitions are designed for remote detonation, the clamps allow operators to align explosives for maximum efficiency. This setup also positions the munitions with the drone's camera, giving pilots a clear view of the target and ensuring precise detonation. Unlike Cold War-era munitions that Ukraine previously adapted for drone use, these frag grenades are purpose-built for modern drone warfare, providing enhanced accuracy and destructive capability. Russian social media and military bloggers raised the alarm about the new Ukrainian rounds as soon as they began to appear. Russia's Marines were among the first troops confirmed to have encountered it. They warned, "Landed a quadcopter drone with a new 360-degree shrapnel ammunition. Be attentive and careful. The enemy uses newer and newer weapons." Documents from Shockwave Dynamics state that the armor penetration for a FRAGS round is 25 mm. It's primarily designed for destroying more lightly armored vehicles protected by cope cages, such as infantry fighting vehicles and armored personnel carriers, but that does not mean it's useless against tanks. One circulating video showed a drone armed with a FRAGS round crashing into a Russian tank. After the explosion, the footage showed a penetrating gash toward the top of the turret. This would have been damaging to the crew inside. The increased use of rounds specifically designed to penetrate cage armor, deliverable via small drones, means that Russia's beleaguered tank fleet is facing even more hurdles in the near future. Until it can find a way to adequately protect its tanks against drones with jammers, we can expect the cope cages to continue to struggle to cope as the war enters its 4th calendar year. One thing's for sure, Russia's tank fleet, which had sent shivers down the spine of Western leaders since World War II, has seen its reputation go up in smoke, literally. The term cope cage might be a term that originated with Ukrainian propagandists, but it's stuck, and it's become a calling card for Russia's lost reputation, all thanks to the ingenuity of Ukrainian weapons designers. What do you think is coming next in the tank war in Ukraine? Will Russia finally find a way to equip its armored vehicles with proper jammers, or can we expect more improvised cope cages in the near future? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. Now go and check out Russia's back finally breaks, the worst week ever, or click this other video instead.